I shook the client's hand across the polished oak table, and just like that, the $25 million deal was closed. Months of late nights, flights, strategy calls, and negotiations had finally crystallized into one signature on a contract that could change the company's future. The ink was barely dry when I felt a strange shift in the room. The CEO's son, Brandon, who had been nothing more than a spectator during the meetings, leaned forward and said, "That was tough, but we pulled it off." The client smiled politely, shook his hand too, and left. My name is Thomas Reed, 48 years old, senior account executive at Weston & Kane, one of the most cutthroat firms in the finance industry. For 15 years, I had built my reputation deal by deal, climbing from small accounts to the kind of contracts that made headlines. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't political, but I was relentless. I knew every number, every clause, every pressure point to move negotiations in our favor. I was the guy who delivered. But that afternoon, standing in the conference room with Brandon Weston, the CEO's golden boy son, I realized something. He wasn't there to learn. He wasn't there to support. He was there to take credit. And minutes later, he did exactly that. When we returned to the office, Brandon called an emergency meeting. The CEO himself sat at the head of the table, looking proud as Brandon presented the deal as if it had been his own work. Slide after slide, he repeated phrases I'd written, ideas I'd crafted, strategies I'd deployed. And then he turned to me, smiled in that smug way only entitled men can, and said, "We appreciate your help, Tom, but your services are no longer needed." The room went silent. No one met my eyes. Not the CEO, not the board. They had decided. Months of work erased in seconds. My career at Weston & Kane severed by the handshake of a man who had never earned a single client. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I smiled once, nodded, and said only 2 words, "Good luck." I packed my things in silence. A framed photo of my daughter, a leather notebook full of strategies, the pen I'd used to sign the deal. The younger employees glanced at me with pity, but none of them spoke. Brandon watched from the glass office, smirking, already celebrating his victory. What he didn't realize was that the deal wasn't just a contract. It was a living thing. It required care, management, trust between client and negotiator. And Brandon had no idea how to hold it together. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking the city skyline. I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. I was calculating. Silence is a weapon, and patience is its trigger. Weston & Kane thought they had discarded me. Brandon thought he had won. But in the business world, arrogance collapses faster than any deal. Days later, my phone rang. The name on the screen was Weston & Kane. And when I answered, the panic in their voices told me everything I already knew. The empire Brandon thought he had stolen was already cracking. The call came late on a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk at home, reviewing notes I'd kept from the deal, when the screen lit up with a number I knew all too well. Weston & Kane. For a moment, I let it ring. Silence has a way of unnerving people, and I wanted them unsettled. On the 4th ring, I answered. The voice on the other end wasn't Brandon's. It was the CEO himself, Richard Weston. His tone was clipped, strained. He said there had been developments with the $25 million contract. He asked if I could spare a moment to clarify a few things. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge what had happened days earlier. He spoke like nothing had changed, as if I was still part of his company. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch until he repeated himself, a little less confidently this time. Then I said one word, "Understood," and I hung up. That was the first crack. Because the truth was simple. Without me, the deal couldn't breathe. The client hadn't shaken Brandon's hand with trust. He had shaken mine. Every clause, every concession, every carefully worded promise lived in my notebook, not in Brandon's memory. I had built the bridge brick by brick, and now Weston & Kane were standing on it without knowing how it held. The next day, Brandon himself called. His voice was sharp, impatient. He said the client was stalling, raising concerns about terms that should have been clear. He asked if I'd forgotten to brief him properly. I listened in silence, then ended the call without a word. I could feel the pressure building on their side, but I didn't rush. I didn't reach out. I waited. Because silence isn't weakness, it's control. And the more they scrambled, the more power shifted my way. Meanwhile, I began preparing. I gathered every email, every draft, every contract revision I had personally negotiated. I compiled them neatly, stored them in a folder labeled simply, proof. If Weston and Kane wanted to pretend I was irrelevant, I was ready to remind them just how central I had been. 2 days later, the client called me directly. His tone was polite, but beneath it was frustration. He said Brandon had tried to renegotiate terms we had already settled, and it was creating distrust. He asked if I was still with the company. I told him no. There was a pause. Then he said, "That explains it." He didn't need to say more. I knew the deal was already slipping. Back at Weston and Kane, the panic must have been rising. I imagined the boardroom filled with silence as Brandon tried to bluff his way through explanations he didn't have. I imagined Richard Weston staring at his son, realizing too late that arrogance doesn't close deals, it destroys them. I didn't have to lift a finger. Their collapse was already in motion. And when silence finally broke, it would be my voice they needed. By Monday morning, Weston and Kane's silence broke. My phone lit up with an email from Vanessa, the company's head of legal. The subject line read, "Urgent assistance required." The message was polite, almost formal. She wrote that the client had raised serious concerns about the contract execution and that the board wanted to consult with me immediately. It was wrapped in corporate politeness, but the desperation bled through every sentence. I didn't reply, not right away. Instead, I opened the folder I'd created, proof. Inside were every draft, every amendment, every signed-off email confirming the details Brandon was now fumbling to explain. I knew exactly where this was heading, and I wasn't going to rush. Patience was leverage. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Brandon. His voice, once smug and sharp, was raw with panic. He said the client had threatened to withdraw entirely, taking the $25 million deal off the table. He demanded that I return to the office, just for optics, until things were stable. I listened without interrupting, then let the silence linger long enough for him to hear it. Silence has weight, and I could hear it pressing on him. Then I ended the call. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote out 3 steps in my notebook. Step 1, freeze. Let them sweat. Step 2, track. Document every desperate call, every email, every message. Step 3, respond. But only on my terms. Quiet execution doesn't mean inaction. It means precision. By Tuesday, the CEO himself tried again. His message was less formal than before, almost pleading. He wrote that Weston and Kane valued my contributions and wanted to discuss a path forward. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of what they had done, just a lifeline thrown too late. I didn't respond to him either. Instead, I prepared a second folder, labeled Exit. In it, I compiled not only the contract records, but also correspondence with the client, proof that the trust lay with me, not the company. If Weston and Kane tried to bury me, I would bury them first, with their own signatures as the shovel. On Wednesday night, the client called me again. His voice was firmer now. He said bluntly that if I wasn't personally overseeing the deal, he would walk away. He told me he didn't care who Brandon was, or what name was on the building. Trust wasn't transferable. It was earned, and Brandon had none. I didn't make promises. I told him I was considering my options. Silence on my end made him push harder, asking what it would take. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because sometimes the strongest move isn't to seize the moment. It's to let it ripen until it falls into your hands on its own. And I could feel it already. Weston and Kane was rotting from the inside. The longer I stayed silent, the faster they decayed. By Thursday morning, the cracks in Weston and Kane had turned into fractures. The client had officially paused execution of the contract, citing internal instability. Brandon tried to spin it, claiming it was a minor delay, but I knew the truth. Without my involvement, the $25 million deal was already bleeding out. That afternoon, another email landed in my inbox, this one marked confidential. It came directly from a board member, a man named Robert Kent. He had been present in the room when Brandon fired me, but unlike the others, he wasn't blind. His message was short, stripped of corporate polish. He wrote, "We need to meet. Off record." I didn't reply right away. I printed the email, slipped it into the exit folder, and went for a walk through the city. I'd learned long ago that silence isn't just about holding back words. It's about creating space. And in that space, others reveal themselves. Robert already had. More would follow. That evening, Brandon made one more attempt to corner me. He showed up outside my apartment, wearing his expensive suit and false confidence. His voice carried that same arrogance, but now it was layered with fear. He said the company would make it worth my while if I just came back quietly and helped repair the deal. I stood in the doorway, listening. I didn't answer. When his voice cracked, I closed the door without a word. The truth was simple. Brandon didn't want me back for the company's sake. He wanted me back to save his own reputation. He had taken credit for the deal, and now that it was crumbling, he was exposed. Silence stripped him bare. Later that night, I sat at my desk and reviewed the proof and exit folders side by side. One was a record of everything I had done for the company. The other was a weapon, a blueprint for their collapse if I chose to pull the trigger. Quiet execution requires timing, and I felt the moment approaching. On Friday morning, the client called again. His voice was no longer polite, it was decisive. He said flatly that unless I was reinstated as lead negotiator, the contract would be void. He didn't care about Brandon, didn't care about Weston and Kane's politics. He trusted only me. That was the death sentence, though Weston and Kane hadn't read it yet. I didn't celebrate. I didn't rush. I simply wrote 2 words in my notebook. Almost ready. Because I knew what was coming. They would call again. They would beg. And when they did, I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't argue. I would let silence hold until they paid the price for underestimating me. In the end, it was never about revenge. It was about control. And now, piece by piece, control was shifting back into my hands. By the following week, Weston and Kane was in full damage control. News of the stalled $25 million deal had leaked into industry circles. Competitors smelled blood. Clients grew nervous. Internally, I imagined the boardroom filled with red faces, Brandon sweating through his tailored suit while his father searched for someone else to blame. But there was no one left. They had cut me loose, and now they were watching the consequences unravel in real time. On Monday morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a polite request. It was a demand. Vanessa from legal insisted I return for an emergency board session. She wrote that my professional obligations required me to assist. I read the message twice, then closed it without replying. Silence is its own answer. By noon, another call came. This one from Robert Kent, the board member who had reached out earlier. He said the board was considering drastic measures. He wanted to know if I'd meet privately before the session. His voice carried the weight of a man trying to stay ahead of a storm. I agreed, not with words, but with silence. He would wait until I chose the moment. That evening, I reviewed my exit folder one last time. Inside were emails showing Brandon's attempts to renegotiate terms already agreed upon. Notes from the client explicitly stating their distrust of him. Drafts in my handwriting tracked changes with my initials. Evidence that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just a defense, it was a weapon. On Tuesday, Weston and Kane called again. This time it was Richard Weston himself. The arrogance was gone from his voice. He admitted they were facing challenges and that my expertise was needed to stabilize the deal. He tried to frame it as a team effort, as if we were still colleagues. I let him talk. When he finished, I said nothing. The silence stretched until he asked if I was still on the line. Then I ended the call. Later that night, the client reached out once more. He said bluntly that his company would not move forward unless I was reinstated as lead negotiator. He told me he was drafting a letter that would make it official. That letter was the nail in the coffin for Weston and Kane. Once it landed on the board's desk, there would be no escape. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I sat at my desk, wrote 3 words in my notebook. Now they beg. Because I knew what tomorrow would bring. The board would call again. This time, not with demands, not with arrogance, but with fear. They would offer titles, power, money, and I would sit in silence until I decided exactly how far I wanted them to fall. They had mistaken my calm for weakness. They were about to learn the truth. Silence isn't surrender. It's the sound of preparation. Wednesday morning, the inevitable happened. I received a formal invitation to an emergency board meeting. Not from Brandon, not from Richard, but from Robert Kent himself. The language was careful, almost deferential. We would greatly appreciate your presence. It wasn't a demand anymore. It was a request from men who had finally realized the ground was crumbling under their feet. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I opened the exit folder once more, sliding the documents into a slim leather case. Not to wave them around, but to remind myself, I didn't need to raise my voice. The facts spoke louder than any argument. At noon, I walked into Weston and Kane headquarters for the first time since my firing. The receptionist, who had watched me carry my box of belongings out days earlier, now looked at me with wide eyes, whispering my name as she printed a visitor's badge. The silence of the office told me everything. Rumors had already spread. When I entered the boardroom, all eyes turned to me. Richard Weston sat stiffly at the head of the table, Brandon beside him, pale and tight-jawed. Robert Kent nodded faintly, a signal of recognition. No one spoke at first. The air was thick, the kind of silence that only exists when powerful men are forced to confront their own mistakes. Richard finally broke it, his voice strained. He said the client was threatening to terminate the contract unless I was reinstated. He said the company's reputation was at stake, that jobs were on the line. He asked me, directly, to return. I didn't answer. I opened my case, placed a single document on the table, the client's latest letter stating in clear terms that they trusted only me. I slid it forward without a word. The silence after that was heavier than any speech. Brandon shifted in his chair, trying to defend himself, saying he had only tried to streamline negotiations. No one looked at him. His voice cracked, filling the room with the sound of a man unraveling. I leaned back, arms folded, and said nothing. My silence forced them to reveal more. Richard promised reinstatement, bonuses, even a promotion. The board chimed in, one by one, offering what they thought I wanted. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't about a title. It was about control. Finally, Robert Kent asked the question none of them dared to voice. He asked what it would take for me to step back in and salvage the deal. The room fell quiet again, waiting. I let the silence stretch until even the air felt brittle. Then I spoke for the first time. Conditions. Non-negotiable. Their faces told me everything. They were ready to agree to anything. And I was ready to set the terms. The boardroom was still when I spoke those two words, non-negotiable conditions. They shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, waiting for me to continue. I let the silence hang a moment longer, watching Brandon sweat under the weight of it. When I finally leaned forward, my voice was steady, calm, and deliberate. I said the first condition was simple. Brandon would step aside. No leadership, no involvement, no authority in this deal or any others tied to the board's largest accounts. The contract was too important to be left in the hands of arrogance. The room stiffened. Richard opened his mouth to object, but Robert cut him off with a sharp look. Everyone in that room knew the truth. The client didn't trust Brandon. And trust was the only currency left. I slid another document across the table, the client's letter stating plainly that Brandon's actions had jeopardized the agreement. No one spoke. No one could. The words on paper were final. My second condition followed. I would return, but not as an employee to be discarded at the whim of office politics. I would report directly to the board, bypassing Richard and Brandon entirely. My authority would be independent, my budget protected, my word final in all matters related to client negotiations. Again, silence. The kind that meant they were already calculating what it would take to agree. Brandon tried to protest, saying it was unprecedented, but his voice broke halfway through. His father's glare silenced him more effectively than I ever could. I didn't even look his way. I had already erased him from the table. The third condition I delivered slowly, deliberately. I wanted every board member to feel it settle in their chest. I said I would take full control of the $25 million deal, but I also wanted documented authority over every major account moving forward. If Weston and Kane wanted to survive, they would do it under my terms. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard Weston looked like a man cornered, his empire balanced on the edge of collapse. Robert Kent studied me carefully, then nodded once, as if he had expected this all along. No one moved. No one argued. The quiet told me everything. I had won before they even opened their mouths. I closed my case, stood, and said the last thing they didn't want to hear. You have until noon tomorrow. Then I walked out, leaving them in their silence. Because silence wasn't just my weapon. It was now their prison. When I left the boardroom that day, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The silence behind me told me more than words ever could. They weren't debating whether to accept my conditions. They were calculating how quickly they could surrender. By the next morning, the answer arrived in the form of an email. It wasn't from Brandon. It wasn't even from Richard. It came directly from the board's legal office. The subject line read, "Agreement of Terms." The body of the message was short, stripped of all formality. They accepted every condition I had laid out. Brandon would be sidelined, my authority would bypass the usual chain of command, and I would assume direct control not just of the $25 million deal, but of all top-tier accounts. I read it twice, then filed it into my proof folder. Not because I doubted them, but because documentation is the foundation of control. At noon, I walked back into Weston & Kane. The same receptionist who had watched me leave with a box of belongings days earlier now stood to greet me with a nervous smile. Whispers rippled through the office as I passed. No one spoke to me, but every pair of eyes tracked my steps. The man they thought had been discarded was back, and this time the silence around me was respect, not pity. The board was waiting in the conference room. Richard Weston sat with his shoulders slumped, a shadow of the man who had once looked untouchable. Brandon wasn't there. His chair was empty, pushed slightly back from the table, as if it had been erased. Robert Kent gave me the faintest nod as I entered, a quiet acknowledgement that this was no longer their meeting. It was mine. They confirmed the terms, one by one, with clipped voices. No resistance. No negotiation. Just surrender disguised as agreement. I didn't thank them. I didn't smile. I simply opened my case, placed the client's letter in front of me, and said, "I'll handle it." That was all. And yet the silence afterward told me they understood exactly what those words meant. That evening, I called the client directly. His voice was steady this time, relieved. He asked if things were back under control. I told him yes, and I could hear the tension break on the other end of the line. Trust had returned, not to Weston & Kane, but to me. When the call ended, I wrote 2 words in my notebook: position secured. Because this was no longer about one deal. It was about leverage. Weston & Kane had handed me the keys to their empire without realizing it. And now, every move they made would depend on me. They had fired me. They had erased me. But silence had rewritten the script. And when I finally spoke, they had no choice but to listen. Once the board signed off on my conditions, I moved quickly but quietly. Weston & Kane was fragile, the $25 million deal hanging by a thread, and every eye in the company was watching to see what I would do next. I knew better than to make a show of it. Power doesn't need noise. It works best in silence. I spent the first 48 hours doing what Brandon had never bothered with, rebuilding trust. I called the client, not with promises, but with precision. Every concern they raised, I addressed with documented proof. Every concession they feared, I clarified with exact language. I sent them the same neat records I had kept all along, the ones Brandon had never even looked at. By the end of the second day, the client's tone shifted. Their voice steadied. They weren't talking about withdrawing anymore. They were talking about moving forward. Inside Weston & Kane, the silence was different now. Employees who had once looked at me with pity now avoided eye contact altogether. They knew I wasn't just back. I was untouchable. Brandon kept his distance. I'd see him occasionally, lingering in the halls, trying to look busy, but the board had made it clear he was finished. His silence was no longer arrogance. It was fear. Richard Weston, however, was harder to read. He kept his composure in meetings, spoke formally, tried to act as though nothing had changed. But his eyes told a different story. He knew what the board knew, what the employees knew, what the client knew. Control had shifted. His empire was no longer his. It belonged to the man he had allowed his son to discard. I didn't press. Not yet. Quiet execution requires patience. I let them settle into the new reality while I strengthened my position. I brought in outside auditors to review the company's top accounts, presenting it as a move to restore confidence. In truth, it was a way to map out the weak spots, the fractures in Weston & Kane's foundation. Every file I opened told me the same story. Arrogance had rotted the company from the inside. On Thursday, Robert Kent approached me privately. He said the board was impressed with how quickly the client had returned to the table. He asked if I was considering a permanent leadership role. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The question itself was enough. That night, I wrote 4 words in my notebook. The end is near. Because I wasn't just here to salvage one deal. I was here to decide the fate of the entire company. And when the time came, I would close more than a contract. I would close the chapter on Weston & Kane itself. Not with shouting. Not with spectacle, but with silence sharp enough to cut an empire down. By Friday, The deal was mine again, signed, sealed, and moving forward. The client had sent a formal confirmation, praising the clarity of my leadership and stating outright that their trust rested in me, not Weston and Kane. I forwarded the letter to the board, knowing it would circulate through every corner of the company. The silence that followed was more powerful than applause. Everyone knew where the power now lived. That afternoon, the board called one final emergency meeting. I walked into the room carrying nothing but my leather case. Brandon was absent again. The board hadn't even bothered to include him. Richard sat at the head of the table, shoulders sagging, a man who had already lost but hadn't yet admitted it. Robert Kent gestured toward me, giving the floor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. I simply laid out what was already true. The company's survival rested entirely on the foundation I had built. The deal they had nearly lost was secured not by their authority, but by my silence, my preparation, and my execution. And that was no longer a temporary arrangement. Richard tried to argue, saying Weston and Kane had always been a family company, that his name carried weight. I slid the client's letter across the table. It was the same move I'd used before, but this time it wasn't about one deal. It was about legacy. The silence afterward told me everything. His name no longer carried weight. Mine did. The board voted that evening. By unanimous decision, I was given full authority over all major accounts and direct oversight of the company's future negotiations. Brandon was formally removed from client-facing roles. Richard retained his title, but it was symbolic, an empty crown on a hollow throne. Control had shifted permanently. I left the building as the sun was setting, the city glowing beneath me. There was no celebration, no satisfaction in gloating, just quiet certainty. For years, I had delivered results without demanding recognition, and when they tried to erase me, I let silence do what words never could. At home, I opened my notebook one last time and wrote 3 words: game, set, quiet. Because in the end, it was never about the $25 million. It was about respect, about leverage, about proving that the man they had underestimated could dismantle their arrogance without ever raising his voice. Some men fight back loud, with anger, with noise. But the real power, the kind that reshapes empires, moves in silence. And when Weston and Kane finally collapsed under its own weight, history would not remember the shouting in boardrooms or the empty boasts of a CEO's son. It would remember the man who rebuilt control quietly, methodically, and permanently. Me, been through it. When they crossed the line, and you made sure they felt it.